These NBA players were blacklisted from the NBA due to their own actions, and no one fits this mold better than Dion Waiters. When Waiters' son recently asked him why he's no longer playing in the NBA, Dion responded, "Your dad is out of the league. Not because of his talent, it was my attitude, my character, and not understanding that it's bigger than me." Dion certainly hit the nail on the head with that, because not so long ago, Dion was emerging as a top sharpshooter in the NBA. But after one unreal roller coaster, I think the world would be shocked if we ever see Dion on the floor again. Dion was a wild one. This dude made his teammates call him Kobe despite never starting a single game in college, but through some off-the-bench explosions managed to surge his draft stock as his sophomore season winded down, soaring from a mid-20s guy to the 4th overall pick to the Cleveland Cavaliers. Now, Dion was certainly always a controversial guy. He got in fights with coaches and teammates, compared himself to a caged lion, came in overweight, and displayed an unwillingness to play any sort of defense. This guy was an overconfident young guy who needed to be humbled a bit. But that confidence at the college level paid off big time. Dion is a shot creator in the purest form. Although he's not a lights-out three-point guy, you could not convince him otherwise. And although undersized at his position, his solid base and athleticism helped him compete against the trees. Dion had a ton of offensive talent and could play that spark plug role as well as anyone in college basketball. But even at that, his ceiling seemed to be higher. Dion could explode for 30 points, then would score 6 the next night on 2 for 12 shooting. With an NBA trainer smoothing out his three-point stroke and running him at practice when he does some boneheaded play, there were hopes that Dion could be something in the NBA. Unfortunately, the first problem, of which there were many in Cleveland, was that Dion's fit was pretty garbage. As a 6'3" tweener of a two-guard, who wasn't really willing to share the rock although showing signs as a passer, Dion joined the backcourt with Kyrie Irving, who was basically a 6'2" shooting guard in a point guard's body, both of whom were not great passers nor great defenders. The fit was just really not there, and the team struggled at 24-58 despite a pretty solid 15-point rookie season from Waiters and an all-star sophomore campaign from Kyrie Irving. This was Kyrie's team. Although this was barely a team, I mean these guys were dog water, but with his irrational confidence level, Dion Waiters was upset that Irving was getting the shine that he thought he deserved. Dion accused Kyrie and Tristan Thompson of playing buddy ball while cutting him out of the offense despite having a pretty wild 26% usage rate and shooting a poor 41% from the field and 31% from deep. Dion would increase his production over the next year to 16 points on improved efficiency at 43 and 37% splits, which certainly looks pretty solid on paper. However, with Dion, you never knew what you were going to get. Dion was one of the most wildly inconsistent players in NBA history and never managed to fix the issue. Dion was honestly not as great as he thought he was. Although admittedly he did have talent and his undeserved confidence did help him as a shot creator, pretending he was Kyrie Irving when he's really Dion Waiters resulted in some ugly basketball at times with some brutal shot selection. Following a second poor season from the Cavs, these guys entirely flipped their future around acquiring LeBron James and Kevin Love. Reportedly, LeBron would try to mentor Dion a bit and take him under his wing, but in his words, he really couldn't be helped. When you're young, you're still trying to find yourself coming into the league. I think Brown was trying to help me with that, but I was so stubborn back then. Dion was pulling bad shots and had bad body language on the court, on the bench, and in the locker room. Really, there was kind of a role for Dion on this team as a secondary scorer when Kyrie or LeBron were on the bench, but as a guy who can barely shoot over 40% from the field, Dion isolations weren't exactly a form of productive basketball. He was going to have to fill some holes on this team by playing hard on the defensive end and knocking down his open three balls. And after shooting 25% from deep with a dogshit attitude, Waiters forced Cleveland's hand to move him in a trade to Oklahoma City. Dion really didn't show anything that we hadn't seen from him before in OKC, scoring in the low double digits while barely cracking 40% from the field. He was not in any way a consistent piece alongside Russ and KD, but offering off-the-bench shot creation is a rare and valuable talent nonetheless, that got guys like Jamal Crawford paid for a long time despite having similar inconsistency issues. The Thunder had planned to roll with Dion for a few more years, but after Durant backstabbed the team, Dion was no longer needed. With limited interest around the league, Dion found his spot where his talents could be utilized. After losing another 6'3" shooting guard in Dwayne Wade, the Miami Heat had an opening in which Dion would find the best fit of his career by far. Waiters landed just a one-year, $3 million deal with the Heat, who don't have much patience for someone who doesn't fit the mold of their culture. and with what was likely his last shot in the NBA before being looked at as more of an end-of-the-bench guy in the NBA, Dion answered in a major way. Waiters just got better and better as the season went on in Miami, finishing with 16 points per game and a career high in assists and three-point shooting percentage. Dion was doing everything that the Heat needed, helping them get back to relevance after the end of their dynasty, before an ankle injury would sadly end his season before he had a chance to lead them into the playoffs. But not without the Heat noticing that he had the best season of his career, rewarding him with a fat 4-year, $52 million contract. This was certainly jumping the gun a bit, but the Heat, unlike any team before, were willing to put their money where their mouth is, to let Waiters know that they believed in him. But, unfortunately, this is where the train came off the rails a bit. After ankle issues, Dion would come back to the team out of shape, where Eric Spoelstra himself would even have to comment on the issue, stating he needs to get back into Miami Heat shape. Waiters began bumping heads with coaches and teammates once again, but this was nothing compared to the shitstorm that was yet to come. While traveling on the team jet, Dion would pop a few THC gummies while unknowing that the altitude enhanced the effect, and launched him into a full-on panic attack. Waiters would be suspended for 10 games before just 1 month later, Dion would call in sick to a team event before posting an IG picture on a yacht party for his birthday. Just like that, after a few injuries and boneheaded moves, the Heat were willing to give up on the guy they just threw a fat bag of money at, moving him to Memphis, who waived him shortly after. Waiters would land just one more spot in the NBA, with the 2020 Lakers signed him on their championship run for the purpose of deep bench depth, playing him in just 5 blowout games in the postseason. With no teams calling his phone, Dion had the harsh awakening that his talents never lived up to his attitude. This guy was not worth a contract in the NBA, flat out. Depression hit him hard after the NBA, stating, "I was just not having fun. I had thoughts of not being around, but I've got kids. I'd rather be miserable for the rest of my life than to leave my kids without a father. I didn't want to be around anyone, and everybody was still asking me for shit. I'm a one-man army as far as finances go. I'm the backbone. Shit was dark. Some days, I'd sleep in my bed all day. I had nothing to look forward to. I wasn't working out. It's a mental battle." Dion, as we covered, has acknowledged his immaturity is really what cost him his career in the NBA. Dion had one career year in the NBA, with his first year in Miami, that even as someone who's always been ultra skeptical on this guy's game, given all the limiting factors, was incredibly impressive. Unfortunately, after failing to give the Miami Heat the respect that the organization showed him, Dion had to pay the price for his actions. Blackballing himself from the game he worked his whole life at. Due to his ultimate immaturity on and off the floor, Dion, in the middle of his prime, was placed on the no-fly list never to play in the NBA again. Now, there are a few players that commonly get hit with the blackballed label, and I think Dion is a prime example of someone whose erratic behavior caused no team to be willing to take a shot on him. But in some cases, this is not always as black and white. In the case of Enes Kanter, however, the self-diagnosed blackballed label becomes much more controversial. Kanter's known for a few things in the NBA. This guy, over his 10-year career, was a very good back-to-the-basket player, and even in limited minutes, at times could come in and put up points very efficiently, often ranked highly in the 6th Man of the Year voting, which is pretty rare for a big guy, and especially for a big guy who plays this traditional brand of basketball. On the flip side, the guy also couldn't guard a parked car. In a screener role, this guy looked like it was literally his first time seeing that action. His feet were concrete, and he was consistently one of the worst defenders in the NBA, while being unplayable late game on many teams. This was essentially Enes Kanter in a nutshell, but while playing in the NBA, what was less spoken on was his political activism. For the most part, this is because nobody really cared. As a Turkish American, Kanter was outspoken about the Turkish government following the 2013 Turkish corruption scandal. Kanter would go as far as to call their leader the Hitler of our century. I mean, I know nothing about Turkish politicians, and I'm assuming none of you do either, and that's why throughout many of the early years of his career, no heads were really ever turned. Things with this Turkish dispute would pick up a bit, as Kanter's father would be arrested and charged as a member of a terrorist organization. Kanter did not believe the charges, nor could he contact any friends or relatives in Turkey due to the fear of phone lines being tapped. Kanter would eventually be subject to a $500,000 bounty by the Turkish government, labeling Kanter himself a terrorist and disallowing his return to the country. See, Kanter was always a political guy, but it wasn't until Kanter poked his head into another conflict that people began to give a shit. After being subject to an ESPN documentary, Kanter would come for the head of the Chinese paramount leader, labeling him as a brutal dictator. China certainly did not respond well, banning all Boston Celtics games from the country while Kanter was on the roster. Things would only get worse. After Daryl Morey would criticize the Chinese government, causing outrage from the communist nation and costing the league hundreds of millions in the process, Kanter would go on a series of TV interviews criticizing the Chinese government before in 2022, Kanter would be waived and never play another NBA game again. Now, things certainly sound bad, and as far as I know, they might be that bad. But to first cover the NBA's ass a little bit, let's cover the other side of the story. Nearly 3 years after Kanter's initial comments and 2 years after Morey's comments, Kanter would go on an interview stretch that was reportedly given the okay by Adam Silver, who stated that he never wanted to censor any players for their personal or political beliefs. Kanter did in fact play for a few years after his initial comments, and at the time his career ended, this guy had the defense of a traffic cone. I mean, there were certainly reasons to believe this was the end of his run regardless. But there is a bit of reason to believe that Enes Kanter may not be totally wrong when he says that the NBA blackballed him from the league. See, after Daryl Morey spoke out on the protests in Hong Kong, the NBA did fully shit their pants, forcing Morey out of Houston and apologizing for what he said, launching a response from both Republican and Democratic American leaders saying that the NBA sold out an American citizen. It also reinforces the Chinese Communist Party view that those who point to a Chinese repression in Hong Kong are at best stating opinions, not facts, as well as being a betrayal of fundamental American values. I'm not trying to sway you one way or another. I mean, I'm sure the NBA would not want a repeat of the Daryl Morey situation for the sake of their own pockets, but my mom also plays better defense than Enes Kanter, so as far as I'm concerned, whether Enes Kanter's comments had anything to do with the end of his career is yet to be proven. If you're watching this right now, there's a 95% chance that you aren't subscribed to the channel, so make sure to change that. It's free and it really helps me get more of these videos out to you at a higher quality and at a longer duration, so make sure you click that button for me. Now, the story of Royce White is certainly comparably controversial to Enes Kanter, but his blackballing from the league may not be for what you think. See, Royce White has made a major resurgence in the media due to his political activism and actually running for the Senate in Minnesota, as well as his controversial messages, writing things like Alex Jones was right in his head in the Big Three League. But this major right turn from NBA basketball came after his blacklisting for one of the oddest reasons you could imagine. See, in high school, Royce White was one of the best players in the country. I mean, this guy was just an all-out beast with freakish athleticism and a terrifying frame, but chose to stay home for college, attending the University of Minnesota. Unfortunately, White would not play a single game for Minnesota due to a legal issue taking place before the season. Royce would steal a laptop from the Mall of America and would also shove the mall cop that tried to stop him. As the university and the basketball program began to investigate and look into suspending him for the season, White just said screw that and went to ball out for the Iowa State Cyclones instead, which he certainly had success at. Royce would put up a very good 13.5 with 9 boards and 5 assists, leading the Cyclones in all stats in a very impressive fashion. Royce is one of those guys you can watch play for about 5 seconds and tell that this guy can play. But the longer you watch this guy ball out, you can tell that he can really play. As a burly 6'8" forward, Royce had surprising athleticism and a pretty good handle on the ball, making him a regular face-up threat who could isolate bigs that had zero problem getting to the basket. What made White's game incredibly fun was that he could frequently rip down defensive boards and get out in transition. And what made White's game incredibly effective was how this guy was always one step ahead of the defense. White had a very high basketball IQ that, when paired with his intimidating frame and impressive athleticism, made him look like a lock for the NBA, no question about it. Unfortunately, that same head that made him one of the most intriguing prospects in college basketball also made him the biggest question mark in college basketball. Royce, of course, was a little prone to making some bad decisions, as stealing a laptop can tell you, but Royce also had a very significant battle with crippling anxiety. According to NBADraft.net, Royce was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder in high school, which could lead to any number of problems at the next level and has been mentioned as a major cause for concern by a number of scouts. He's had trouble flying, and reports surfaced that he chose to go to Iowa State and not Baylor because he didn't want to fly there. White is a high-risk, high-reward prospect if there ever was one. His development will have to be handled very carefully by whichever team drafts him. If he's selected by a team that is willing to be both patient and let him play to his strength, then he could very well be the steal of the draft. Well, someone had to take this guy, of course, and barely slipping past the lottery to 16th overall, the Houston Rockets were the ones that were willing to take the chance, and off the bat, they had to deal with the issues that came with taking the mystery man of the draft. Royce stated that he was scared shitless when facing any plane turbulence, and missed out on Rockets media day and training camp while waiting for teams' permission to travel by bus rather than on the jet. Royce would fly at Iowa State, but going from 20 to 98 flights per year was going to be too much for someone with a major phobia. Royce managed to cope with his anxiety on team flights only through heaping amounts of Benadryl and Xanax, which he was already feeling the effects of when it came to his energy level, and was also fearing the potential of addiction and withdrawals if his usage would need to be increased in the NBA. Royce had ongoing disputes with the team over mental health accommodations early in the 2012-2013 season. By late December 2012, White had not reported to work with the Rockets, leading to a tension between him and the organization. On December 29th, the Rockets assigned him to their D-League affiliate, the Rio Grande Valley Vipers, but White initially refused the assignment. This led to the Rockets suspending him without pay for failing to fulfill his contract. Royce, however, would barely play in the G League due to his mental health issues, and would step away from the team entirely, never playing a game for the Houston Rockets before it was clear the team's relationship was sour. Royce would take to Twitter to criticize the Rockets' mental health protocols, as well as the league's lack of resources altogether, before Royce would be moved to the 76ers and waived by season end. White would receive his only shot in the NBA on the Kings, who played him 3 games, and just like that, Royce White was out of the league without having ever scored an NBA basket. The case of Royce White sure is weird as hell, as due to his phobia, he really just couldn't participate in this line of work, and unfortunately, the NBA did not have the understanding or the resources of Royce's issues at the time to get him the help that he needed. It really sucks, man, because although going down as just a guy who was scared of planes, he was a 6'8" freak with ridiculous quickness and passing ability for his size, while having the widest hands and shoulders in the draft class. Royce would go on to just really make a strange piece of NBA lore that was made even stranger after sparking major national controversies for saying things like women are getting too mouthy, and although his NBA career was uneventful, Royce will never leave you without something to talk about. Now, Royce is one of those cases that kind of makes you go, what the absolute fuck? And in the case of Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, that feeling is mutual, but for a very different reason. See, Mahmoud was ahead of his time. I mean, there's really no other way to introduce his story. Life was never easy for Mahmoud, born Chris Jackson, growing up in Mississippi without a father. His mother did her best to provide, but the family struggled with severe poverty. On top of that, Chris was in special education classes until he was finally diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome at the age of 17. As a child, dealing with Tourette's was incredibly difficult. It often felt like a curse. Chris had moments where he couldn't leave a room without flipping a light switch 100 times, or where tying his shoes perfectly would lead to tears after 15 minutes of struggle. Yet his condition turned into a peculiar blessing when it came to the one thing that always went well for him: basketball. Chris's obsessive nature due to Tourette's meant he practiced tirelessly. His compulsion was to swish 10 jump shots in a row before leaving the gym. Even if one shot grazed the rim, he'd start all over. As a result, Chris spent countless hours honing his shot. By the time he was in high school, he was nearly automatic from any spot on the floor. His dedication was so intense that he once hit 283 consecutive free throws, ending a team practice early as his coach called it in disbelief. With his ridiculous work ethic and deadly jump shot, Chris Jackson became a high school star. Twice he was named State Player of the Year, averaged 30 points per game as a senior, and earned a spot as a McDonald's All-American. This success led to a scholarship at LSU, where he quickly became a national sensation. In just his 3rd college game, Chris dropped 48 points. And by the end of his freshman year, he set the record for most points scored in a single game by a freshman with 55. He also set the single-season freshman scoring record with 965 points, averaging 30.2 a game. Chris's success continued into his sophomore year, playing alongside a young Shaquille O'Neal, averaging 28 a game. After that season, he declared for the NBA draft and was selected 3rd overall by the Denver Nuggets. The expectations were sky high. One coach even said Chris was a 6'1" MJ. Jackson was absolutely ridiculous, and really outside of like Trae Young, this is the only guy that actually makes sense to compare to Steph Curry. As a guy who was using on-ball screens to hunt off the dribble 3 balls in the 1990s, this guy's game was insanely unique. and anyone who watched it sure as hell was in for a treat, because this guy was a walking bucket. Standing at 6'1" and weighing 160 pounds, this guy was one of the greatest scorers in NCAA history, and honestly is one of the most entertaining scorers I've ever seen in my life. But his NBA start was rocky. He struggled with injuries, fitness, and medication issues for his Tourette's, I guess. I mean, it seemed like the world was just giving excuses for a guy thought to be a draft bust. In his rookie year, he averaged an inefficient 14 a game, and his second season dipped down to 10 a game. Critics were quick to label him a bust, and at that time, it really seemed like it. The NBA had never seen something like this. I mean, he got the Steph Curry treatment before Steph Curry. A shoot-first tiny guard can't dominate the NBA. Right? Well, something changed in Chris's mindset. He converted to Islam, finding a sense of peace, and returned to the Nuggets in the 1993 season a different player. He averaged 19.2 points and earned the NBA's Most Improved Player award. With his newfound faith, Chris changed his name to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. Yet his most significant change was yet to come. In 1996, Mahmoud made the quiet decision that would alter his career. He stopped standing for the national anthem, viewing the American flag as a symbol of oppression. His silent protest went unnoticed until a reporter covered it in March of that year, sparking a firestorm of criticism. The NBA suspended Mahmoud for 1 game, citing a violation of league rules. Unlike Colin Kaepernick years later, Mahmoud's protest did not garner widespread support from athletes. Instead, he stood alone against a tide of criticism. After his suspension, Mahmoud agreed to stand for the anthem. Yet the damage was done. Fans criticized his religion, accused him of selfishness for fasting during Ramadan, and overlooked his positive contributions, like visiting impoverished neighborhoods during road games to inspire youth. Even though he continued to play well, nearly making the All-Star team in 1996 with a 19-point-per-game average, his career abruptly declined. Just 2 years later, at the age of 29, Mahmoud found himself out of the NBA and playing overseas in Turkey. He believes his fall was due to a league-wide effort to blacklist him after the anthem controversy. He pointed to several incidents as evidence, including the Denver Nuggets trading him just 3 months after his suspension, and his new team, the Sacramento Kings, limiting his playing time and disrupting his rhythm. Ultimately, whether the NBA truly blackballed Mahmoud remains uncertain. What's undeniable is that he went from averaging 19 points per game to being out of the league in just 2 seasons, a career nosedive that still raises questions to this day. Meyers Leonard's rise and fall in the NBA is a tale as much about timing and opportunity as it is about a single devastating mistake. Standing at 7 feet tall with a solid shooting touch from deep, Leonard seemed poised to benefit from the modern evolution of the NBA. A league increasingly dominated by versatile big men who could stretch the floor and knock down 3 balls. For 7 seasons with the Trailblazers, Leonard played a pretty limited role, flashing potential but never quite solidifying his position as a key contributor. Then, his break came with the Miami Heat. In 2019, Leonard signed a $20 million deal with Miami, a payday that marked the peak of his career. With Miami, he would become a starter on a team that would go on to represent the Eastern Conference in the 2020 NBA Finals. Though Leonard's numbers weren't mind-blowing, he was a role player on a star-driven team. His presence as a floor-spacing big man was appreciated. He fit into the modern NBA mold, big enough to bang with big guys in the paint, but with a shooting touch that demanded respect from behind the arc. It was this kind of skill set that could earn him a long career in a league hungry for shooters. While Leonard wasn't known for his on-the-court intelligence, often criticized for making head-scratching plays, his shooting ability masked many of his weaknesses. In a league where three-point shooting was becoming more valuable by the day, he had found a niche. His frame and his shooting stroke were enough to keep him on the floor, and in turn, keep him in the NBA's payroll. For a brief moment, it seemed like Leonard had finally carved out a space in the NBA, a multi-millionaire living in one of the country's most glamorous cities, and playing a role on a competitive team. His future looked secure. But in 2021, Leonard's journey hit a sudden roadblock. A shoulder injury sidelined him, keeping him off the floor and leaving him with ample free time. It was during this period that Leonard decided to take up streaming video games as a hobby, interacting with fans and creating a small but dedicated following. For many athletes, streaming is a harmless way to stay engaged with fans and pass the time during recovery. But for Leonard, this became his biggest nightmare. During one of his streams, Leonard, visibly frustrated during a game, blurted out an anti-Semitic slur. The reaction was swift and unforgiving. Despite his immediate claim that he didn't understand the meaning of the word, the consequences were dire. The Miami Heat, an organization known for its strong culture and accountability, quickly distanced themselves from Leonard, suspending him indefinitely before eventually trading him. From that point, his NBA career was in free fall. Leonard had gone from being a starter on a finals team to an outcast in a matter of days. What should have been a minor hobby had turned into a full-blown scandal. The backlash was intense, both from the public and the NBA community. For days, social media was flooded with criticism, while #CancelMyers trended online. The Heat's decision to cut ties was not only a reaction to the offensive language, but a reflection of the league's shift towards greater accountability and social awareness. Leonard's reputation was in shambles. His injury, coupled with the scandal, left him in a prolonged limbo. For 2 years, he was out of the NBA, a ghost of his former self, sidelined not just by physical injury, but by repercussions of this little mistake. However, during this time, Leonard sought to make amends. He publicly apologized, took part in numerous community events, and dedicated himself to supporting Jewish organizations, trying to show that he was committed to learning from his mistake. In 2023, 2 years removed from the controversy, Leonard finally got another chance. The Milwaukee Bucks, in need of depth, decided to take a gamble on him, bringing him back into the NBA. Leonard's performance, while brief, was surprisingly effective. In limited minutes, he showed he still had skills to contribute, posting per 36-minute averages of 13.5 points and 11 rebounds on impressive shooting splits that flirted with the coveted 50-40-90 club. Yet, despite solid performances, Leonard's return to the league was short-lived. After just 9 games with the Bucks, he was left unsigned for the 23-24 season, leaving his future in the NBA uncertain. The story of Meyers Leonard is ultimately just a cautionary tale. In an era where athletes are scrutinized as much off the court as on, a single lapse in judgment can have a career-defining consequence. Leonard's mistake, whether out of ignorance or carelessness, resulted in a complete dismantling of his NBA career. His momentary outburst during a video game, a context far removed from the NBA court, cost him years of hard work and dedication. Even his attempts at redemption, while commendable, have not been seen enough to erase the stigma attached to his name. I mean, this Meyers Leonard one really just sucks. As a grown man, to spit out a slur that jeopardizes your career definitely stinks, but this is still just a guy who made a mistake before really just being caught in cancel culture's web. It's unfortunate given that guys who literally beat women get off scot-free, but Meyers Leonard was just a domino to fall in what is the changing of the times. Mark Jackson's career in the NBA is a story of brilliance, but also of bitterness. And it's a tale that raises questions about how personal conflicts, egos, and off-court behavior can shape a legacy. After a successful playing career, Jackson transitioned to coaching and found immediate success with the Golden State Warriors, turning a long-suffering franchise into a playoff contender. But despite his success in rebuilding the team, Jackson's exit from the Warriors in 2014 and his absence from the NBA coaching ranks since suggests a darker side to his persona that might have contributed to an inevitable blackball from the league. Jackson took over the struggling Warriors team in 2011. Under his guidance, the Warriors began to develop the foundations of a dynasty, with players like Stephen Curry and Klay Thompson flourishing under his leadership. He was the one who built a system emphasized around Curry's shooting, creating the perfect system for a future 2-time MVP to thrive. Jackson also played a role in Draymond Green's rise, notably opting to play him over David Lee, a decision that would help Draymond become one of the NBA's best defenders of all time. However, Jackson's success as a coach was marred by personal issues that strained relationships with the Warriors organizations. His religious beliefs, particularly his desire to impose them on others, were a major point of contention. In one infamous incident, Jackson reportedly tried to have Steph Curry attend a spiritual healing ceremony at his church to address Curry's ongoing ankle issues, something Curry didn't want to be involved in. This moment stood out as a part of a broader pattern of Jackson forcing his beliefs onto players and team members, alienating many within the organization. Beyond just this, Jackson was also known for his questionable management style. He frequently clashed with assistants, even publicly firing 2 coaches in a dramatic display that only added to the tension within the team. According to reports, Jackson's inability to get along with staff and his controversial nature created a toxic atmosphere. The Warriors owner later commented that while Jackson did a great job on the court, you can't have 200 people in the organization dislike you. Jackson's management style wasn't just toxic on the court, but also in the locker room, where reports suggested he had a volatile relationship with multiple players. His public arrogance was also a factor. Jackson was known for bragging about turning the Warriors' fortunes around, but his inability to take responsibility for his own actions alienated many, including players who felt they weren't getting the support they needed. His reputation was tarnished further by a series of passive-aggressive power struggles, leading some to believe he cared more about his personal image than about the team's success. Despite leading the Warriors to 3 consecutive playoff appearances, Jackson was fired after the 2013-2014 season, just as the team was poised to make a deep run in the playoffs. Steve Kerr took over after Jackson's departure, led the Warriors to an NBA championship in 2015 just a year later. That success only highlighted how Jackson's tenure, while impressive on paper, was ultimately a stepping stone for a future dynasty. One he had built, but wasn't able to see through due to his own dysfunction. The notion that Jackson was blackballed from the NBA after his firing in Golden State isn't a far-fetched conspiracy. His strained relationships and questionable decisions make it clear why he hasn't received another coaching opportunity. It's not about lack of success, but the fact that Jackson's combative personality and refusal to adapt to the modern NBA environment made him a liability for organizations seeking harmony and a collaborative culture. For Jackson, it's a sad irony. His talents were undeniable, but his off-court behavior ultimately led to his undoing. Isaiah Rider certainly falls under the category of forgotten star. Similar to Abdul-Rauf, I'm pretty damn jealous of anyone who got to watch him at his best, because had Rider not gotten in his own way, this guy would have been more than special. With his athleticism and smooth jump shot, Rider quickly became known for his flashy play style, making him one of the most exciting young players in the NBA. He even won the 1994 Slam Dunk Contest with his iconic East Bay dunk, which is still a highlight in NBA history. However, despite all the talent and potential, Rider's career began to derail at a rapid pace. His off-court issues, conflicts with teammates and coaches, and poor decisions ultimately led to the collapse of his promising career. In college, Rider had already begun making questionable choices, including hiring someone to do his schoolwork, which led to his suspension from basketball activities. His college issues didn't hurt his draft stock, and he entered the NBA with high expectations. But it didn't take long for the red flags to appear. In just his second season, Rider averaged over 20 a game, solidifying his status as a future star. Fans were excited about his potential, especially during a time when Michael Jordan was retired, and the league was looking for a new shooting guard to carry the torch. But Rider's attitude and off-court behavior started to overshadow his talent. He was often described as selfish, focused more on his personal accolades than the success of the team. Rider even complained in an interview years later that he should have been an all-star, arguing that there were conspiracies against him. He believed his numbers were worthy, yet players like Nick Van Exel and Eddie Jones were getting the nods instead. His sense of entitlement and lack of self-awareness only added to his growing reputation as a troublemaker. Rider's issues weren't limited to his playing style. He struggled with substance abuse, he was arrested multiple times for drug-related offenses, and ran into trouble with the law on several occasions. In 1996, he was caught with drugs and 4 illegal cell phones, raising suspicions about what he was using the phones for. These legal issues combined with his bad attitude started to wear thin with his teams. One of the most infamous incidents occurred during the 1999-2000 season when he was with the Atlanta Hawks. Despite leading the team in scoring at 19 per game, Rider's behavior became unbearable. He refused drug counseling offered by the team and showed up late to practices multiple times, ultimately getting benched. His refusal to follow basic team rules led to his eventual release. The Hawks waived their leading scorer mid-season, which is almost unheard of in the NBA where talent rules all. The incident was a clear sign that Rider's personality and off-court problems were too much for any team to handle. Despite showing flashes of brilliance off the court, Rider was blackballed by the NBA due to his attitude and off-court issues. By 2002, at just 30 years old, his career was essentially over. Rider's off-court behavior continued to spiral out of control after his playing days. He was arrested for multiple incidents, including domestic violence, cocaine possession, and even stealing a car. He also had numerous run-ins with the law, including accusations of kidnapping his son and violating probation. In recent years, Rider has made an effort to turn his life around. He started a charity to help kids in need, offering them the resources he didn't have as a child. Although his career was marred by poor decisions, Rider has attempted to redeem himself, using his story to help others avoid the same pitfalls. Rider was certainly blackballed from the NBA, but the NBA was certainly right to blackball this guy, which I can't exactly say is the case for DeMarcus Cousins. Boogie Cousins was one of the most dominant and controversial players the NBA had seen in the 2010s. Drafted 5th overall in 2010 by the Sacramento Kings, Boogie immediately showcased his talent with a solid rookie season, Averaging 14, 8, and 2, he was clearly going to be the centerpiece of the team, but his career was quickly marred by his emotional volatility and off-the-court issues. His talent was undeniable, but the drama surrounding him would ultimately define much of his career. From the very beginning, Cousins had trouble controlling his temper. He was a frequent visitor to the referee's ear, leading the league in technical fouls despite playing fewer than 30 minutes per game. The Kings, meanwhile, struggled to build around him. The franchise failed in its draft, passing on key players like Kawhi Leonard, Klay Thompson, and Damian Lillard in favor of questionable selections like Jimmer Fredette and Thomas Robinson. This failure to put a competent roster around him only added to Boogie's frustration, but his emotional problems weren't just a result of a bad roster. They were part of who he was. In the second season, the Kings fired head coach Paul Westphal, reportedly due to Boogie's request for a trade. Westphal had suspended Cousins for 2 games, citing a failure to align with the team's goals, which led to further tension. The Kings moved forward with Keith Smart as an interim coach, and while Boogie's numbers improved, his issues with the coach and management only grew. By the end of the 2012-2013 season, the Kings had once again failed to build around him, and they had taken yet another wrong turn with the firing of coach Keith Smart. But the turning point came when the Kings brought in Mike Malone in 2013. Finally, Boogie seemed to find a coach he respected. Malone's defensive-focused approach worked well with Cousins' skills, and under Malone, Cousins took a huge step forward. He averaged 22.7 points and 11.7 rebounds that season, and for the first time, it seemed like the Kings were trending in the right direction. Boogie was playing some of the best ball of his career, and the team looked like they had a future. Unfortunately, the front office once again failed to sustain the momentum. After a hot start to the 2014-2015 season, Boogie was sidelined for 10 games due to viral meningitis, and the team fell apart without him. The Kings' decision to fire Mike Malone midway through the season was yet another turning point. The team hired George Karl as the new head coach, but the relationship between Karl and Boogie quickly soured. Cousins was never a fan of Karl, and the tension between the two boiled over in 2015. Boogie was clearly upset with the Kings' mismanagement for firing the one coach he respected and hiring Karl, who he kinda hated, and it wasn't long before he publicly lashed out. He was benched multiple times for behavior issues, and his frustration with the team's dysfunction only deepened. By the time Karl attempted to trade him after the season, Cousins was done. He took to Twitter posting snakes in the grass, a clear shot at the management and George Karl himself that had failed him at every turn. By the 2016 season, Cousins was at the peak of his powers. He averaged 27 and 11, adding a 3-point shot to his arsenal, making him even more dangerous. His offensive game was virtually unmatched by any center in the league, but despite his individual success, the Kings remained a mess. But he had no faith in his team's management, and his relationship with his coaches had soured once again. The Kings failed to build a competent roster around him despite his dominance on the court. The 2016 season should have been a turning point in his career. He is one of the most talented big men in league history, and yet he was constantly being disrespected and mismanaged. His emotional outbursts were often blamed for the Kings' struggles, but the reality was that the franchise was never able to put any sort of pieces around him. By the end of the 2016-2017 season, the Kings' dysfunction reached its peak. Boogie was eventually traded to the Pelicans, marking the end of his turbulent tenure in Sacramento. Despite his incredible talent, Cousins was often portrayed as a locker room problem, and this narrative followed him throughout his career. Even though he was undeniably one of the most gifted centers to ever play the game, his emotional issues were consistently used against him. After the trade to the Pelicans, Boogie continued to show flashes of brilliance, but injuries and his reputation as a troublemaker prevented him from ever getting the full respect he deserved. After DeMarcus Cousins' Achilles injury in 2018, he faced a tough reality. His career was in jeopardy. Despite putting up incredible numbers in Sacramento, his volatile personality and temper had left him with a reputation that followed him around the league. After his injury, Cousins was left without many suitors, and it was ultimately the Warriors, who were at the height of their dominance, that took a chance on him with a 1-year, $5 million deal. While the move was viewed as a low-risk, high-reward situation for the Warriors, it spoke volumes about how Cousins had been perceived by the rest of the NBA. The demand for Cousins certainly was not what we expected, simply because Cousins wasn't what he once was. But it wasn't just about his Achilles injury. Also, the baggage that Cousins carried with him. The suspensions, the technical fouls, the on-court altercations, all of it. The Warriors were essentially the only team willing to give him another shot, and it was largely because they were so stacked already that they could afford to take a flyer on someone with his talent, but also the baggage. When Cousins did get a chance with the Warriors, he was still recovering from the Achilles injury, and his performance wasn't the same as it had been in his prime. While he was able to contribute to the Warriors' success, it was clear that the league had largely written him off. His role on the Warriors was limited. Unfortunately, after this stint, Boogie's career was effectively over, but while still clearly having some life in his game, the world was really wondering why, and thanks to Warriors GM Bob Meyers, we got our answer. DeMarcus called me a month ago and said, "Why am I not in the NBA?" And I said, "You want that answer? Because people are afraid of how you're going to act." Asking why, Meyers responded, "Well, whatever the reason is, it's here now." Cousins had some time to think on his unfortunately early NBA exit, in which he said, "Have I made mistakes? Absolutely. Have I done things the wrong way? Absolutely. For that, I'm very apologetic. But I've done even more things the correct way, and I've done even more positive things compared to my negatives. I just don't want those positives to be overlooked, and obviously, whenever it gets to the point where the negatives outweigh the positives, you should probably move away from him. That's just how life goes. But I don't believe I'm in that boat. I'm just asking for a chance to show my growth as a man and a player." Boogie, although still being a big, strong, and skilled stretch big, was never able to really bounce back after his injury despite having a game that wasn't really reliant on athleticism whatsoever. And just like that, the NBA was quick to write off the man who was once far and away the best center the world had to offer. Alongside DeMarcus Cousins, former teammate Isaiah Thomas was also a player that vanished mysteriously from the NBA. Check out that video here, and I'll see you boys in the next one. Peace out.